Hello again. We're returning to our readings from the book What is Man? Adam, Alien or Ape? Now, in this new series of readings from that book, we have completed our reading of chapter 1, which is in fact a review of the entire contents of the book. Now we're going to jump from chapter 1 to chapter 8. And the reason for that is that previous podcasts, way back in the days shortly after the publication of the book, I did in fact do readings all the way through up to chapter 8. And most of those readings were concerned with the relationship of mankind to the cosmos, and also preliminary chapters on man's relationship with the biosphere. And all those podcasts are on the podcast. In other words, if you go back far enough, you will find them. So I'm jumping to chapter 8, and the purpose of that chapter was, and remains of course, just checking it up, the question of identifying the alleged missing links between humans and apes. Evolution teaches that human beings have evolved from apes, and one of the proofs they produce for that claim is that there are many fossils, sequences of fossils tracing the step-by-step change from apes to man. And yet, of course, we can still reasonably refer to a missing link. The transition from apes to man is not by any means as well documented as evolutionists normally claim. So we're going to look at this question. What do the bones and fossils of human beings and pre-human creatures tell us? And what reliance can we place upon the claims of those paleontologists who claim that there is an unbroken transition between apes and men? So here we go on this new reading. And we have a chapter heading, which is Dem Dry Bones, taken of course from the spiritual song, and then a more informative subtitle, What Fossils Really Tell Us About the Rise of Man. And I have a chapter heading quotation from Edward Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And those who husbanded the golden grain, and those who flung it to the winds like rain, alike to no such aureate earth are turned, as buried once men want dug up again. Fitzgerald's verse has the ring of truth, but it would not appeal to a paleoanthropologist. What are paleoanthropologists? They are scientists who specialize in digging up human remains in the hope of discovering the secret of our origins. Paleo means ancient, and anthropology is the study of man. I'll call paleoanthropology PA, and one who practices it APA. To a PA, any fossil footprint, skeleton, or even isolated bone or tooth is truly aureate, Fitzgerald's word, which means worth its weight in gold, if it is deemed to throw light on human antiquity. PA does not concern itself only with humans and their supposed ancestors, known as hominins, but also explores the wider world of hominids, the great apes, including humans and all their supposed ancestors. The American humorist Mark Twain wrote a short story in which one foggy night he met and conversed with a succession of skeletons. They were making their way from an old burial ground to a new one, each carrying its coffin, and complaining bitterly, though politely, about the way their original resting place had been commandeered for housing development. The graveyard desecration was real, but the skeletons were not. Twain was simply putting his own words of protest into the mouths of the long departed. And here lies the problem. It is all too easy for the discoverers of ancient fossils to make them, quotes, say, close quotes, what they want them to say, namely whatever fits their current theory or enhances their academic reputation. Bones can't speak for themselves. Their place in the history of humanity can only be inferred or guessed from their morphology, age, and condition, together with the cultural clues such as tools, the use of fire, and the remains of lunch, which are found with them sometimes. And that's where PAs come into their own. It is their task to study such fossil finds, assess their age, catalogue their similarities, relate them to known races of man, trace their supposed ancestors, evaluate their culture, if any, and assign them to a place in mankind's family tree. In doing so, they invariably make the assumption that modern man has evolved in a Darwinian manner from a more primitive ancestor, and ultimately from some kind of ape. In this chapter, we are going to consider what, quote, dem bones, close quotes, really do tell us, and whether or not they support the evolutionary scenario. Note that in doing so, I shall, for convenience, use the modern and commonly accepted geological timescale for the ages of rock strata, although I have argued elsewhere that it involves unjustified assumptions that exaggerate these ages. Subheading: Is man just an animal? There can be no doubt that man is an animal. Our skeletons resemble those of the great apes, at least superficially. We share with mammals, birds, and reptiles a common body plan: head, 4 limbs, 5 fingers on each hand, that kind of thing. Our internal organs are similar in structure and function to those found in other animals which, like us, reproduce sexually, as do other organisms, including plants. Many animals have brains and nervous systems analogous to our own. In short, we recognize a multitude of similarities among the phenotypes, as they're called, of living creatures. Phenotypes means the way those organisms look and behave. Likewise, as we have seen, many of our genes bear a close resemblance to those of mice, monkeys, and marsupials, not to mention earthworms and so on. Like other animals, we are conceived, born, grow up, and grow old. Like them, we eat, drink, sleep, get sick, and eventually die. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return, said the book of Genesis some 3,500 years ago. Nothing much has changed. But is man only an animal, or is he something more? That is the question addressed in this book, and we must now consider what answers can and cannot be found by sifting through fossil remains. The Negro spiritual Dem Bones celebrates the prophet Ezekiel's Old Testament vision, in which a valley full of scattered human bones came to life, bone by bone, until a great army stood upon its feet. It was, of course, a parable of God's ability to raise ancient Israel from its fallen condition. So might fossils help us piece together the story of mankind? Perhaps, but PA faces formidable difficulties. I am not referring to the well-known fallacies and frauds that have bedeviled PA from its inception as a serious science in the late 19th century. For example, the first Neanderthal remains were identified by one anthropologist as a bow-legged Cossack, while another erstwhile missing link between apes and humans was conjured up on the basis of a single tooth and christened Nebraska Man. The tooth turned out to belong to a peccary, a pig-like animal. The most famous fraud of all was Piltdown Man, an alleged missing link cunningly constructed from a human skull and the jawbone of an orangutan, which fooled the PA establishment for 40 years. While such errors and deceits make amusing and cautionary reading, they tell us nothing about the validity or otherwise of PA as a means of discovering man's origins. But they do perhaps alert us to the difficulties of the PA enterprise. Subheading: Formidable difficulties. The first thing to remember is that PA is necessarily a historical science, not an experimental one. I don't mean that experiments can't be done on fossil remains. They can. For example, DNA fragments can sometimes be extracted from fossil bones and yield valuable information about the origins and relationships of those creatures. But by experimental science, I mean science that can be reproduced in a laboratory or field experiment and reproduce the events that we seek to explain by our hypotheses and theories. Historical science can't do that. because they study unique past events that cannot by definition be repeated. These studies closely resemble crime scene investigations, in which detectives try to reconstruct what happened during an unrepeatable criminal event. Archaeology is another example of historical science, as it examines ancient ruins and artifacts in the hope of reconstructing the history, politics, and lifestyles of ancient human societies. Perhaps the most important consequence of all this is that PA, along with other historical sciences, relies much more heavily upon interpretation than do experimental sciences. With experimental sciences, it is usually possible to devise new experiments to test which of 2 or 3 possible explanations of the data is correct, but such luxury is not available to the historical sciences. New information may come to light if fresh discoveries are made, but that is usually a matter of chance and is seldom under the control of the scientist. It shouldn't surprise us, then, that PA is a subject where different experts offer different interpretations, and the debates often grow heated. Personal reputations are at stake, and access to fossil remains may be denied to anyone who challenge the fossil owner's interpretation. Interpretation-heavy science suffers a further problem. Interpretations are strongly influenced by prevailing paradigms, that's patterns of ideas. We all try to fit new information into our existing view of things. Reading, and I put that in inverted commas, reading our experiences in a way that harmonizes with our existing beliefs and comfort zones. It is difficult to break the mold in which our ideas have been cast, even when new information challenges those ideas. Again, therefore, we need to be willing to question what is considered to be received interpretations that are often presented to us as unassailable scientific facts. As an introduction to the serious stuff, let me take you on a flight of fancy. Our destination is Ethiopia, and our purpose is to uncover a variety of what I will call paleoanthropological pitfalls, the difficulties facing PAs as they seek to interpret their finds. Subheading: Do It Yourself, Paleoanthropology. And I interpolate here to point out that what follows is fiction, but it is a story designed to demonstrate and throw up the non-fictional and genuine problems that the PAs face as they seek to interpret the significance of their finds. So here we are, Do It Yourself, Paleoanthropology. Imagine that you, as an amateur, develop an overwhelming desire to discover the real missing link between apes and humans. You read up on PA and persuade your incredibly rich Uncle Fred to finance an expedition to Ethiopia, ancient name Afar. You set up camp near a crumbling cliff where Assorted bones have previously been found, and put your hired labourers to work. It isn't long before you experience an outlandish degree of beginner's luck. You uncover the almost complete skeleton of a human-looking creature. The skull is fragmented and its other bones are disarticulated, that is, no longer joined together. Some are missing, but by PA standards, your discovery is amazingly complete. You call it Fred in honor of your uncle. Someone asks how old the fossil is, and you suddenly realize that the bones themselves may tell you nothing about their antiquity. So, remembering what you have read about dating such remains, you hastily gather several barrow loads of soil and stones from the site and look around for an outcrop of volcanic rock that can be dated by radiometric means. See later. There's nothing really close, but 50 meters away you do find such rock, so you chip off samples for age measurements. Fred's remains are labelled, packed with due reverence, and taken home, where you submit your discovery to anatomical experts and await their verdict. First, the good news. The bones generally resemble human remains, but the arms are too long and seem to be adapted for swinging from branches, that is, for tree dwelling. The bad news is, since the bones have fallen apart, it's difficult to say exactly how the pelvis articulated with the leg bones, affecting whether or not Fred walked upright. Furthermore, several attempts to reassemble the shattered skull come up with drastically different estimates of cranial volume, making the animal's brain size difficult to estimate. Nevertheless, in spite of these uncertainties, you believe you have found an ancestor of modern man. You christen it Homo afarensis frederiki, meaning man from Ethiopia dedicated to Frederick, and set out to establish its place in the human family tree. This is where your problems really begin. One expert who examines the remains declares that it was just a modern human being with a long arm deformity and is irrelevant to human evolution. You disagree, but you have no way to challenge this idea because your fossil is the only one of its kind. To another expert, the bones are those of a giant extinct species of chimpanzee. The creature, he said, walked with bent knees. All the versions of the reassembled skull are wrong, and the creature actually had a tiny ape-like brain. He renames it Australopithecus afarensis frederiki, southern ape from Ethiopia dedicated to Frederick. A third expert claims that one of his own finds bears the title Frederiki, and you have no right to use it, while a fourth says he found this kind of fossil 12 years ago, long before you did, but won't let you or anyone else see it, because he hasn't yet written the definitive scientific paper about it. He says you have no right to name the fossil, since he discovered it first, but declines to identify its role in human evolution. Perhaps dating your discovery will clarify the muddy anthropological waters. So you submit a bone to a carbon-14 dating laboratory, the soil and stones to geological experts, and the volcanic rock sample for radiometric dating. The results actually come through. The carbon-14 measurement is inconclusive. It gives an age of around 3,000 years, very recent by PA standards. But the bone is porous, and the lab suspects that live bacteria may have contaminated the specimen with their own carbon-14. The bone could be almost any age. The radiometric dating of the volcanic rock puts its age at 2 million years or so. But the experts point out that this rock may have no age-related connection with the fossil you found. If a fossil lies below a stratum of igneous or volcanic rock, it is reasonable to assume that it is older than the rock. But this neat arrangement doesn't apply to your skeleton. Even if it did, radiometric dating doesn't necessarily give correct ages for rock, as we shall see presently. What about the soil and stones? They can't date the skeleton radiometrically because they are erosion products from more ancient rocks, which could predate the creature by any amount of time. But there is one interesting piece of news. Among the stones are index fossils that are typically found in rock strata from the Pleistocene period, which, according to the accepted geological timescale, lasted from 2.58 million to 11,700 years ago. Could this mean that Fred is of similar age? Perhaps, but perhaps not. The index fossils occur in water-worn pebbles, and even if the pebbles were deposited during Fred's lifetime, they could have derived from much older virgin rock. They put an upper limit on Fred's geological age, but leave the lower limit undefined. Finally, what seems to be an ancient sharpened flint knife is found among the stones. Could this suggest that Fred used tools to skin and cut up food? Or might it indicate that humans hunted Fred and his tribe for their lunch? No one knows the answer. Also, the knife might just be a broken flint that happened to resemble a crude tool. Or, like the pebbles, it could be much older than Fred. Or again, it might have been transported from a more recent location, the last time the cliff suffered a rock fall. However, you have faith in Fred and decide to opt for the radiometric rock sample date, even though the rock measured was some distance from his final resting place. Armed with this tentative age, you find a copy of the latest evolutionary family tree for hominids and consider where in that tree you should put Fred. Do you succeed? You'll find out at the end of this chapter. We shall continue that reading from chapter 8 of the book, What is Man, Adam, Alien or Ape, in the next podcast.